about. I was originally given a title, "What's the point in a network?" and I've changed it slightly to "What is the ICE network for?" because I think that's a much easier thing to answer, basically. So first of all, hello, my name's Jed. I'm a waiter and a member of the ICE network. Right, feel free to. This is quite a small, informal thing. So if you don't know what I'm talking about at all, if it makes literally no sense, feel free to just be like, "What the fuck are you talking about? Stop me," whatever. You can all applaud at the end. And I'll kind of fill in with a bit of extrapolation. So I don't want to go on too long, so I'll probably show a bit of general terrain and then move on from there. So first of all, I just want to highlight kind of three contradictions or ideas that may be in tensions that will probably be running throughout each thing I talk about, or running throughout the whole thing. So keep these in the back of your mind, keep these plates spinning, if you will, and we'll. I think they'll kind of come up repeatedly in the discussion that we're going through. So first of all, it's tradition and beyond. So obviously for ourselves as the IS network, one of the tasks we set ourselves when we left the SWP and formed ourselves was to be representatives of the IS tradition, so reinvigorate the IS tradition and very much seeing ourselves as part of the IS tradition. Now this is obviously in tension with the beyond part. We are seeking to reconstitute and rebuild the revolutionary left. We see ourselves as a part of that process and not some group that just needs to grow incrementally until it becomes the future leadership of the the revolutionary class. And so there's also been a willingness of people to look beyond our tradition and a dialogue with other political traditions, other political groups, whether that's anarchist groups, the syndicalist tradition, communism, what else? Anarchism. There is this tension between a refounding and the tradition. I also want to refer to a traditional base and new forces in terms of within the working class. So one thing that's been highlighted in a lot of discussion recently is how the left has kind of rested on what were the traditional strongholds of the working class movement in Britain. So in the post-war period, this was very much shop stewards networks, the kind of workplace networks in the manufacturing sector in particular, that then formed the base and the audience for much of the radical left. Today we could say it's more in the public sector, who have been taking a lot of kind of on-off action against the austerity assault, and this has traditionally been very much where the left has seen its base at. There's also a tension there because there's new forces, there's whole areas of the working class, whole sections of the economy that are really outside of, if there's perhaps the sector of the economy and the sector of the working class that have replaced the kind of quite a lot of jobs that used to be relatively well paid, well organised within the manufacturing sector. And I want to highlight this contradiction because I don't think it's as clear cut as an old and a new working class or an old and a new left. I think there's a real crossover between the two, and I think that you're not going to find a solution for one without the other. So it's hard to imagine, for example, a wave of union organising and working class action across the new sectors of the economy without some kind of action in the old bastions of the working class or whatever, and vice versa. It's hard to see the likes of Unison, Unite, GMB members, for example, breaking out of the bureaucratic stranglehold which has held back their action, the tremendous strikes that we've seen that have been ultimately bureaucratic, without new ways of organising and kind of more grassroots methods of organising coming about in different sectors of the economy. So I want to highlight that tension. And finally, and these are all kind of interrelated in terms of, they'll go around all of the different discussions we'll be going through. It's the microsect and the broad formation. Obviously, a large part of where we've come from has been the realisation that actually the politics of the sects, whether it's the SP, the SWP, whatever of these different groups, is driven more by their own kind of narrow self-interest and organisational short-term goals than it is any kind of real political project for the working class, any kind of real strategy for what the working class needs. On the other hand, whilst we participate in numerous broad projects, broad formations, such as the attempts to found a new left party, a new workers' party in the form of left unity, we also constantly find ourselves as a minority and in opposition within that. So we constantly see the need for kind of maybe smaller, much more narrowly defined politics within the broad kind of project to rebuild the working class political culture and to rebuild a political project for the working class, we see the need for a kind of cutting edge, or like a something that can kind of critique the politics of the trade union bureaucracy, for example, within that. So I just want to refer to those three things because I think they'll run through the discussion and they'll come up as we go along, so I think it's worth kind of having in the back of his minds. So now we enter the fifth chamber. Now, for those of you who aren't too familiar with the work of the Wu-Tang Clan, the fifth chamber is, why can't it be all so simple? Bear with me. So basically, if we think about the situation we're in today, like the short-term political situation, and compare that to where we were at in 2010, 2011, 2012, we can see quite a big difference. And I think, a large part of this is obviously objective. The objective situation is more complicated. The political movements, the political crisis that we can see springing up in different states and like across them is more complicated. But I also think there's a subjective element where perhaps we are more willing to recognise the complications and the problems as we've kind of, in many cases, broken from like the narrow politics of a sect and its old defined certainties. So let's look back to kind of 2010, 2011, 2012. Of course, like first off, we had the revolutions, classic revolutions in the Middle East, where you had massive social forces being mobilised, kind of popular revolutions, but with a clear element of like working class mobilisation, mobilisation of the urban poor, peasantry, popular classes, for example, mobilised within that, and assaults on the state, on the regime, and really like a rebirth of a revolutionary process that we haven't seen for a very long time. Something that really is completely different from the colour revolutions or the end of like the Soviet Union or any of the like political explosions really that we've seen for a good generation, really, since Spain, possibly bigger than Spain and Portugal. In Europe, obviously, we had the like stepping up of anti-austerity movements. We had like mass strikes coupled with mass movements on the streets driven by the working class and the youth. So we have, like, for example, the protests in Greece, the square occupations in Sant'Agnes Square, running alongside a series of mass strikes of, like, the kind of familiar scenes of street fighting and tear gas flying around and whatever. And similarly in the Iberian. So it felt like, as well in Britain, that we were kind of part of something much bigger, and it seems like, oh, it's all just upwards and onwards, comrades. Look, there's revolutions happening every other week. Oh, there's a mass strike just round the corner. And actually, because of the politics we were armed with, or disarmed with, and the approach we were taking to these things, it seems like all upwards and onwards a set of certainties. All we need to do is really go and like intervene in these things, and if we sell enough papers and whatever, that they will kind of reach their natural conclusion, which will be a victory. Now, it's clear now that we're in a much more complicated situation. Obviously, what's happened to the Middle Eastern revolutions, whilst the revolutions in the North African revolutions, whilst the revolutionary process is still ongoing, it's clearly in a much more complicated period. We've clearly got, like, for the moment at least, counter-revolution reigns supreme in Egypt. Assad doesn't seem to be going anywhere very fast at the moment. There's a kind of like, not a stalemate, there's constant bloody fighting, but you kind of see what I mean. And then of course Ukraine, like here we have what appears to be a mass popular movement against like authoritarianism, against the political classes, against the regime, and using the methodology of that we kind of naturally identify with the left-wing progressive movement, the mass occupations, rounds of street fighting, the mass assemblies, but actually it's clearly something much more complicated than a kind of like, goodies versus baddies thing. I think there's clearly like a couple of goodies and a lot of baddies on either side of the conflict in Ukraine. And actually, why I'm like kind of going through all of this kind of stuff is, in order to pick apart these things, we need an actual proper analysis of where capitalism's at as a global system, what are the tensions within imperialism, within the working class movement in these specific countries, within the general political terrain we're acting in, because a reliance on kind of old certainties and that things will just mechanically work themselves out won't work for us and won't actually leave us in a situation where we have really anything to say or lead to any kind of effective action. And I think there's an element of this, like, can it be also simple when we look back to the post-68 period where you had like masses of struggle like breaking out to be honest, like right across the world, but particularly in Europe, you had like fairly advanced workers' movements, high levels of strike action, different like youth movements, black movements, feminist movements, whatever, which all kind of formed a mix. And it seems like in the midst of a like rebirth of crisis after years of stability, that the left, the radical left in particular, and the working class movement had very much a stake in those things and could be part of the solution to the crisis. And to an extent, maybe we can see like old familiarities of going on in the 80s as well. And I think part of this is, who are we talking to? Who is the working class? What are the sections where the left should be trying to talk to? Or really a recognition that there are different sections that we need to be talking to at the same time, which will need to be like in a dialogue with in slightly different ways on the basis of the differences between different bits of the working class. So obviously there's an objective thing here, but I think part of it is also subjective, because the confidence that the next big thing was going to be the turning point. November the 30th, and then the Tories will be on the run. I mean, Paris used to turn it as the one great push analysis, which was basically like, all we need is a couple of big strikes and this government will like fall, and everything else will just naturally fall into place. Which clearly isn't the case. Obviously the government's very unpopular. That doesn't lead to a resurgence in the working class movement, or particularly left-wing ideas, or whatever, as we can see. Although we shouldn't over-egg that, UKIP's an anti-establishment vote, we can see, for example, in Ukraine, or we can see, maybe to an extent, but again, I wouldn't over-egg it with UKIP, but a dislike of the political elite, a dislike of economic elites, doesn't actually necessarily translate into like gains for us. So this is kind of just a general terrain then, that I just want to lay out before we start through, which won't be too much. So basically, that for me, the kind of difference between 2010 and today, like, highlights part of what we need to be getting into, and what I think hopefully the IS network can play a role with it. Does this make sense so far, or is this just a mad tangent? Sorry, it's probably isn't your typical left-wing meeting. You've all recognised, it's fine. So like, but you should do, mate, that's great. Right, so then this is next bit's been subheaded Exodus and Genesis, leaving and a new beginning. So, right. This was put quite nicely in a recent interview of Richard Seymour on Resonance FM, promotion for his new book, Against Austerity, which was basically that, and he put it quite nicely, he said, coming out of the SWP there was a tremendous energy was released through the explosion, which led people to reassess a whole load of political ideas, a whole load of political practices, a whole load of ways of working, and really actually start to interact with theory, to interact with practice in a critical way, rather than just being given your marching orders and going out and trying the same thing. And really, I think that's what we need to get back down to. That's not to say that everything that's come out of the SWP crisis has been theoretically sound, or politically sound, or anything. In fact, I'd say much of it hasn't been. But what we're going through at the moment, I think, is a process, and I think it's one that we need to codify a bit more. I mean, we've all got 1,000,001 critiques of, like, the left we've left. How do we then, I think that needs to be codified in a way to put it to bed, to leave it behind, and then to start to develop really, what do we want to do instead? But what I want to say is we need to go beyond Matthew, which is the first chapter of the New Testament, where Jesus is going around denouncing all the old bastards or whatever. And just as we can go around and we can denounce Tusk, we can denounce bits of bureaucracy within left unity, we can denounce the trade union bureaucracy, this will only get us so far until we can really work out from our denunciations. Yes, we think these people are wrong for these and that reasons. We think their modes of operating are wrong. How do we then want to how do we want to create the dynamic to build a real alternative to that, and a real difference to that? And I think that this is part of what the IS network really needs to do, is to kind of, in a way, codify and argue over our experiences and our critiques of the SWP's politics, and then to look forward of where we're going. And again, I think there's probably a contradiction here again as well, because the IS network isn't just composed of people who left the SWP in March, 2013 or whatever it was. Since we've kind of left, we've met up with a whole other bunch of fantastic comrades. We've got Javard here, the prestigious Steve Freeman, of course, the members of artists formerly known as Permanent Revolution, which was a split from Workers' Power, a whole great load of people, different older activists, different younger activists, and this has really, for me, been part of actually really refreshing my politics and re-engaging with Marxism, which has ended up with this garbled mess rather than a nice, clean, orthodox exposition of Trotsky. So what we're looking at is really a reconstitutive project, a refounding project of the left, but I think this takes place on different layers, and we kind of need to think how we interact with this on different layers, the different tactics, the different approaches we'd use, but trying to actually integrate into like an actual consistent approach. I mean, one is like, where's working class organisation at in general? Where's the trades union movement at? How does that relate to the actual shape of the exploited class in Britain? You know, the trade union movement, and this isn't to knock it, obviously we need to defend it and extend it as much as possible, represents a minority of the working class. And again, it's complicated, but the most active elements of it, at least, be they like teachers, lecturers, whatever, as much as they're being done over at the moment, as much as there's a tax on their conditions, on their wages, do represent a relatively better off position within the working class compared to like other sections, another minority of the working class, which will be like migrant labour, 0 hours, minimum wage, whatever. This is something I think we need to recognise in order to be like, how do we want to build a working class movement that can re-inject a dynamic of self-organisation and self-organisation basically into, there's still 7 million trade union members in Britain, but which are held back by the bureaucracy or whatever else. But it's not necessarily that simple. Whilst also like pushing into new areas and building new dynamics there. The second thing is this like the question of like the voice of the working class, the politics of the working class. With the decline of social democracy, which is becoming sharper and sharper by the day, particularly with like UKIP and whatnot, we can see that there's not the voice of the working class, even as like an institutional voice within the state that you might have traditionally had from like the Labour Party or whatever. So we're in favour of like broad working class political projects such as Left Unity or whatever, but I think we see the need for to reconstitute the kind of minority pursuit of like revolutionary politics in Britain. We need to really seek to rebuild like root and branch the revolutionary left in Britain. I mean, one thing in particular that I've come to recognise across the last couple of years or last year or so is that there's a whole bunch of people who kind of, before you couldn't really have proper conversations with, just be like, oh, are you coming to this or that, who now I found since I've left the SWP will tell me, these are people who've been around the radical left and the revolutionary left whilst not being members of any groups for years and years and years. So they've seen it all, they've seen the campaigns being messed about, they've seen themselves being used as little chess pieces or whatever in that, been patronised and therefore wouldn't necessarily really always put forward their opinion in those forums because they didn't really see it was get listened to, it didn't really matter, who have got immense and great critiques of the revolutionary left. I mean, they may not all be like, thoroughgoing Marxists, but I think there's definitely like a constituency there that the far left kind of tried to use as like mobilising fodder, but never really actually had a real kind of conversation with about how they should be organising, what they should be doing. A lot of this comes to mind, a lot of the activists around the universities and stuff in Sheffield who would be around every single campaign or whatever, and in particular when UAF kind of when a succession of mobilisations in Sheffield superseded UAF, you could really see their critiques and thoughts and stuff start to come out, and actually the role it could play within organising newer formations or a newer dynamic on the left. Right, finally, this is kind of my two concluding points. I hope I haven't gone on too long, probably, yeah. This is called Back to the IS, Back to the IS, Back to the ISSR. Question mark, Back to the Future. So it's all about, oh yes, we're in the 21st century now, we need a communist movement. So where does that leave us now, and what has the IS got to do with that? What are some microceps from 60 or whatever years ago, got to 30, 40 years ago, got to do with our political situation now and the need to build a new working class revolutionary movement in the 21st century? Why the IS? I think there's things that we can learn from it. For a start, they were another small group, but a small group that had a sense of their own proportion in a time when every person with two mates and a dog saw themselves as the future leadership of the revolutionary class, who'd be like storming the bourgeois castle and instigating implementing Trotsky's transitional program. Everyone with a dog thought they were that in the like late 50s, early 60s, whatever. The IS didn't think they were that. Kind of maybe did to an extent, but they saw themselves as, they had a sense of their own proportion, what they could do. They also knew who they were talking to, but I'll come back to that a bit more later. They had an analysis, and again, this isn't, we can discuss the rights and wrongs of different bits of this analysis, but through like an integrated theory of state capitalism, of the permanent arms economy, deflected permanent revolution, they had an analysis of the imperialist world system at that time, like economically, politically. They had an analysis of the like post-World War order, of the Cold War order, which allowed them to then, make political arguments and build a political movement and intervene in political movements within the post-war period. Now these were all like the kind of USPs that defined them against a plethora of other Trotskyist groups. And again, this isn't necessarily about the strengths and weaknesses of these different theories, which something people might want to discuss afterwards. But it was an analysis which gave them something. The other thing that's really important that goes along with it is the analysis of the what do they call it, the shifting locus of reformism, by which they meant that people were looking perhaps less to like Labour politicians and parliamentary projects and thought, hey, we could get ourselves a pay rise anyway. There was a lot of peace work going on. People could negotiate day by day on a shop floor to advance their own living conditions and whatever. And the IS saw quite clearly, actually, the task of themselves as a kind of like revolutionary propaganda group was to intervene into that arena to try and translate that into like piece by piece kind of economic demands, like steady advancement of people's like living conditions, and turn it into a political movement that could challenge the state. Now in the end it's kind of, the state did it for us in 1970 whatever, when they locked up the dockers. Similarly, like the miners' strike, you could see the coming together of this kind of shop floor organisation, rank and file kind of day by day economic organisation, and political fights, smashing the Tories like pay freeze or whatever it was. It ended up bringing down the Tory government, blah 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 blah. Most of us are quite familiar with that. If you're not, there's numerous great books you can read about it. So I think that's one thing that I want to kind of like highlight. Although they saw themselves as like a small group, they had a kind of analysis of the world around them, which gave them a like compass by which to then intervene. It was actually quite theoretically creative. It was breaking out of some of the old orthodoxies and well-worn traditions of the past. It was actually reasserting the best of tradition in terms of reasserting genuine ideas of like liberationary ideas of Marxism, the revolutionary ideas of Marxism as against, kind of stagist Stalinism or kind of like people's inflated self-importance of like the WRP or whatever. But really crucially, they saw like a base. They saw where they wanted their roots to be, and the role that base and the dynamic going on within like movements and dynamics that existed outside of the IS. They saw how they could see that as a route to which a new revolutionary party that's like could be called a party could emerge from that. Now, obviously, that all went out the window with the founding of the SWP and led to the split of the IS. Maybe that's the original sin of our present situation. Probably not, but that's again something we can discuss. So, taking from that, where are we at now? And maybe, what role can the ISN play within the tasks of today? And again, I'd like to restate, I don't think like the ISN is necessarily it. I think it's how do we want to kind of create a kind of left where these kind of discussions can go on, and hopefully some like organisational conclusions can follow out from it. So we do need an analysis, whether it's Lenin or the IS. Some of you may recognise this, one of my internal documents. They had an analysis of like the global situation of like imperialism. They had an analysis of what that meant in their state, and then from those two things, deduced from those two things, they had the like, what does that mean in the working class movement? What should we be arguing for? Who are we arguing against? What are the tactics we should be arguing for? What are the strategies we should be arguing for? So for Lenin, obviously, it was like imperialism, World War I, blah, blah, blah. The state, the Tsarist state, is a like, backwards, semi-feudal entity with advanced capitalism within it. Again, I didn't really sign up to that till later. And then within the movement, why does that mean you should be in the Bolsheviks or doing what the Bolsheviks suggest rather than the Mensheviks or the SRs or the cadets or whoever else? The IS had that. They had an analysis of state capitalism, blah, 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 all this and that. They had a sense of what was going on in the British state and the politics of the British state, and then they had what were the necessary tasks within the labour movement, within the left, to follow on from that. And really, comrades, I think this is what we need. We need a kind of analysis of the global situation. So let's go back a couple of points. How do we want to understand the Ukraine? We need to understand it within the context, I think, of, we're living in the dying decades of the American empire. America's constructed a global system, yes, throughout the Cold War, but then it's kind of become dominant since the end of the Cold War. It's set up a kind of system of governance within its own image, with military, economic and cultural pillars that it rests upon, whether that's the EU, the South Asia Alliance, their alliances in the Middle East. These are now bit by bit fragmenting, falling apart, having to be shored up or whatever. That's what's going on at the moment. That's not all of, but a fair amount of the complicated situation in the Ukraine, and that's why it's not as simple as saying we should support the Russian state rather than our own, or we should support. And I think it's part of what's lying behind it. I think in all of the future upsets, explosions, whatever to come, is going to be the constant question throughout the next couple of decades is going to be the decline of the American empire, what will replace it, and the whole wave of potential horrific cataclysms and imperialist wars and mass slaughter that could happen. And how do we want to stop that from happening? In terms of within the British state, obviously there's a big shift going on within the British state. I think there's one weird thing about the left in Britain is it hasn't really got an analysis of anything. It's just kind of the next demo, the next strike, the next whatever. There's not really analysis of how the British state's working, how is the British state changing, how is the politics and the ideology of the British state. This is something that we should get down to understanding, and not just with comrades in the British state. I mean, fantastically, there was a Plan C meeting which I didn't go to, because I couldn't make it, on anti-Deutsche, an anti-nationalist movement within Germany. A lot of the same questions we're debating about how to confront UKIP, they tried to do with right-wing populist nationalism, what they did with the neo-Nazis. And so you can imagine turning up to a neo-Nazi group rally in Germany and saying these lot are neo-Nazis generally seems to be quite effective, and you get a load of kids lobbing masonry at them. Didn't quite work with the new populist nationalists, so they've had to kind of go back and think, how do we want to do this? So again, when I say we need to get to grips with the British state, that shouldn't be seen as some insular Britain discussion. I think there's many things we could learn from the likes of Spain with the upcoming elections. The kind of if we could pull off an indignados 2 weeks before the British general election, that would be amazing. It would be transformative. I don't think we'll be able to, but we should be trying to learn from these things as well. Finally, within the movement, what should we be fighting for within the different bits of the working class and the working class movement? So it's been quite rambling, it's been quite vernacular, but hopefully it made a bit of sense at the end. Can you all remember your contradictions and how they worked through the discussion?